Thank you so much for joining me for these series of videos. By way of introduction, my name is Zach Kelsey.
I'm Jim and Bess.
And so for this series, we're going to be looking at the kings of the United Kingdom. I was telling a colleague at work about this, and she got very confused because kings of the United Kingdom, you think of Europe and England and in Scotland, but this isn't what we're talking about. We're talking about the United Kingdom of Israel, that time period between the 10th and 11th centuries BC, ruled by Saul and David and Solomon, a time period that ended with the division of the kingdom into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. A lot of times we look at the stories of these men as children's stories, something great for our kids to learn from, but not having a lot of information for us as adults. And then we further simplify it by saying Saul is a bad king and David is a good king, and Solomon started out good, but didn't end up there at the end. That's really not who they were as individuals. That's not who they were as humans. Like everybody, they had some good and they had some bad. So I thought for this series, what we would do is look at what they did really well and what they didn't do very well and see what we can learn from their examples. So today, we're going to start out by looking at the successes of Saul. Now, in order to set that context, we really want to look at what happened. The people of Israel entered into the promised land and began to capture the land. God told them, come in and wipe out the people that were there. God knew through his wisdom the example and the influence of the Canaanites would be negative upon the people if they all dwelt there together. But we find at the beginning of the book of Judges that they didn't do what God told them to. They didn't push them all out. And so they began a vicious cycle over the next couple hundred years where they would serve God, and then they would be tempted to serve idols after the ways of the Canaanites. So we see this vicious cycle over and over where God would be pleased with their service as they served him, and then they would be tempted to serve the idols of the Canaanite nations instead. And so those Canaanite nations would be allowed to come up and subject them into servitude for quite some period of time until they learned their lesson. They cried out to God for a deliverer. God would provide that. They would repent. They would serve him until they didn't. And they began to be idolatrous once again. At the end of the book of Judges, we see that despite all the lessons and the number of judges that came up to teach them to follow God, they didn't learn the lesson. And the very last verse of the book of Judges, in chapter 21 and verse 25 says, in these days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. God had been trying to teach them over and over, you need to follow me. Do what's right in my eyes, because I am leading you through paths of righteousness. They didn't learn that. Instead, they followed after what they felt was right, according to their own understandings. Fast forward through the book of 1 Samuel. In chapter 8, we see the Philistines, once again, are inflicting the people of Israel. Samuel is the judge at the time. He's getting old, and his sons are not following after him. They're also wicked as well. The people see this, and they see and they're concerned that Samuel's going to die, and there's going to be no one to protect them and judge them after this. And so they come to him, once again doing what they felt was right in their own eyes, with a request that probably shouldn't have been asked of in the first place. In chapter 8, the leaders come to Samuel in verse 5, and they say to him, look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us, like all the nations. Verse 6, and the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So God allows this to happen. It's not what's going to be best for the people. It's not seeking after the ways of God as he desired for them to live, but he's going to allow them to follow after their own folly and pursue this thing. So Samuel goes out. He finds the person God points him to. If the people want a king like the other nations, God's going to give them a king like they are asking for. And so God points Samuel to Saul. And we see this selection in verse 9. Samuel meets with him. He anoints him. And then in verse 10, he presents him to the people. That's where we're going to pick up our reading here in chapter 10 and verse 20. And when Samuel had caused all the tribes of Israel to come near, the tribe of Benjamin was chosen. And when he had caused the tribe of Benjamin to come near by their families, the family of Matri was chosen. And Saul, the son of Kish, was chosen. But when they sought him, he could not be found. Therefore they inquired of the Lord further, Has the man come here yet? And the Lord answered, There he is, hidden among the equipment. So they ran and brought him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upwards. And Samuel said to all the people, Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? That there is no one like him among all the people. So all the people shouted and said, Long live the king. Then Samuel explained to the people the behavior of royalty, and wrote it in a book and laid it up before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house. And Saul also went home to Gibeah, and valiant men went with him, whose hearts God had touched. But some rebels said, How can this man save us? So they despised him, and brought him no presents, but he held his peace. So this is exactly what they're asking for. Samuel looks the part. He's tall, he's handsome. We read that at the beginning of in the beginning of chapter 9. This is what they wanted. This is what their heart wanted, was a king after the other nations, and God gave them that. So we see here in this passage, Saul really has a rough start, but it's not a terribly unsuccessful start. And some of these things we see where he is actually trying to pursue God in this moment.
Absolutely. And going back to what you talk about, how he's described, I think that's really key. When we look at these kings, and specifically Saul in this case, we look at his heart, and from the get-go, it would seem as if he was a heart after God in some of his actions. And there was some meekness that we see. He's hiding amongst the equipment. So it's not, he has some humbleness with him. And so he has the look, he seems to have the heart. So, and when the people come to him, they're excited. They seem to really desire to have him be their king.
Right, absolutely. You touched on he's hiding amongst things. In this moment, he's humble. He's also scared, right? And we see this a little earlier in chapter 9. We didn't read all of this, but there's some hesitancy on his part to fulfill this role. But once he has to fulfill it, God's putting him forward. He's saying, you need to do this thing. He steps up. He does it. He doesn't, when the people pull him out from the equipment, he doesn't run the opposite direction. He stands there. He faces them as the anointed by God to fulfill this role, and he does it.
I would suggest to that, as we see a little bit later, he really doesn't just do the job. He goes 100%, even 110%, because he leads the people in war as he is commanded by God, and he unifies the people. And so not only is he looking the part, having the heart, he's wanted there by the people, well, now he's inspiring the people like a good king should.
Absolutely. In fact, some of these people he's inspired come with him back to his home to stay with him. I find it very interesting that these are described as men whose hearts God had touched in verse 26. It's so important that we surround ourselves by godly people. Saul did that in the beginning. God's given us that opportunity today. This is the purpose of the church, right? We see in Ephesians 4 and verse 11, and he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, in the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting, but speaking the truth in love, may grow up in all things into him who is the head, Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knitted together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. Saul recognized here the need to be surrounded by the right kinds of people. If he's going to live up to the potential, and he does have the potential, otherwise God wouldn't have put him in that position, To be a godly and rightful ruler, he's got to have the right influence in his life. And so some of these men that he's surrounding himself with initially had that potential. Within the church, that's what God has given us as well, for the purposes of equipping us, for edifying us, for uniting us. We see in other passages, stirring up one another for good works, admonishing one another. James 5:16, we're to confess our trespasses and our sins one to another, so that we can be strengthened and know how to serve God better, so that in the end, the church, the local church, functions in the way that it should as it strives to worship and serve God. We can only do that if we're surrounded by godly individuals also at the same time.
When you think about that, you think about how individuals can help you, but there's a duality there where when you are called, and as we see here, Saul was given this role of being a king, and while he was scared and while there was some humbleness there, we do see him eventually stepping up. And when he surrounds himself by these men, while they improve him as a man and as a king, he as the king and the leader he is called, and he improves the men and the men of Israel. We see that the tribes of Israel are united, and think about the efforts and actions of one man upon many people throughout Israel. And so when you apply that to our lives today, yes, you are to surround yourself with good individuals who are seeking after God, because they will help equip you and they will help encourage you. But also think about your role and what you're called to do and how you can be of encouragement and the dividends that pays throughout the Lord's church.
Oh, absolutely. No one can be edified unless someone is doing the edifying and someone is being edified by that. It's a two-way street, and we got to work together hand in hand to get down it, right? Yeah, absolutely, excellent point. You mentioned earlier that he raised an army. Let's go ahead and look at chapter 11 of 1 Samuel. We see here that the Ammonites come against Jabesh Gilead. And so the people here are trying to make some sort of treaty or pacify the Ammonites so that they're not going to come and destroy them. And so the Ammonites say in verse 2, they're going to, yes, we'll make a treaty on one condition. What you have to do is you have to put out your right eye. Everybody has to put out the right eye, and then we'll be friends. The elders here in verse 3 realize that's a terrible proposition. And so they're not going to do it. And so they sent for help. Saul receives the message in verse 5. He raises the army. He goes down in verse 11. So it was on the next day that Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch and killed Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it happened that those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. Then the people said to Samuel, "Who is he who said, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Bring them in, that we may put them to death." But Saul said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished salvation in Israel." Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there." So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they made sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. We see this point, as you mentioned earlier, where Saul not only has to look the part, but he has to step up and walk the walk too. He does. He gathers, he amasses the armies of Israel, and he leads them into battle. And they're successful because they put God first as their leader, and Saul is leading them as the spiritual leader of the kingdom at this time.
Yeah, and I noticed that we see many kings in the future. There's almost a bloodthirstiness, and there is a command to wipe out the nations that were before them. What we also see is that Saul uses some wisdom to unify the people, and while he has some opportunity to get rid of his enemies, and some wisdom might suggest that may be the better option, he uses that time to save the lives of those. And when we think about that application today, we are going to have enemies as Christians and followers of the Lord. And sometimes we want to go after revenge, things like that. But when we look at Saul's example, Did he go after his enemies like
Right.
that? No, he chose to create peace and build those bridges. And who knows, we don't know what happened to those individuals, but I would surmise that that unified and strengthened the nation.
Yeah, I think we definitely see that in verse 15. All the men of Israel are rejoicing greatly. He had mercy. As king, he 100% had the right to put to death, as it says, I think in verse 27 in chapter 10, he calls them rebels, right? These are rebellious individuals who are speaking against his kingship. He had the right to put them to death, to exile from the kingdom, throw them in prison, whatever he wanted to do. He didn't do that. To your point, we also have that responsibility too, as you said. The two greatest commandments in Matthew 22. First one is to love the Lord your God. The second one is to love your neighbor as yourself. That is how you show, partly, how you show love to God is by loving his creation as well. It's irrelevant how they treat you. 1 Peter 2, Peter here is writing to individuals who are suffering under the hostility of Rome at the time. And he calls them sojourners and pilgrims. And he encourages them in verse 12, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. And then he continues in this chapter to talk about a number of relationships that they're going to have where they're going to have to show this honorable conduct. Starting with in verse 13, towards the government. Verse 18, towards your masters and your business. In chapter 3, in verse 1, husbands and wives relationship. In verse 8 of chapter 3, all of you, all your relationships, you need to have this honorable conduct. It's irrelevant how these people are treating you. You need to treat them with kindness and respect and love, ultimately with the hope, as it says in verse 12 of chapter 2, so that they will observe your conduct and glorify God. We see that through Saul's example here. He showed mercy to the people who were rebellious against him. He united the people, and they all glorified God. This is that verse in practice. His conduct was honorable in this moment, and it had the effect it should. When we are also honorable towards those people who treat us harshly, fairly or unfairly, we hope that through our example, they will honor and glorify God as well. They'll see Christ through us, that light shining that's set upon the hill. They'll see it, hopefully, and it will point them in the direction they need to go.
I think you're right. I think when wrong is done to us, whether the other individual or entity thinks that they are in the right, our response, if it is opposite of the typical worldly response, can have such a profound effect on their response. And I usually refer it to as the long game. Short run, it may make very little difference. But in the long run, what you did, what you said in response to their evil, to their hatefulness, may have a major impact on how they respond to the Lord later. And ultimately, part of our responsibility as Christians is to bring others to the Lord. And so if they can remember that we as Christians, we acted differently when confronted with hate or evilness or any kind of disregard, then that is probably going to be a key in winning them over to the Lord.
Absolutely. It's about sowing that seed, right? We talk about the parable of the soils and the sower. You don't know what effect or how long that seed needs to germinate, right? You may not have immediate results. We see lots of examples in the Bible of Christians being thrown in prison. Their example is noted. Look at Stephen. He had that example. People saw what he was doing, how he was serving God. He was hauled before the Sanhedrin. He was stoned. But in the long run, what came from that? We see the scattering of the people. We see the gospel being spread all over the world at the time. And eventually, Saul, who became Paul, right, had the example. And Christ presented himself on the road to Damascus. Certainly, there was a miraculous element to that as well. But as he's looking back and reflecting, I'm sure he looked back and reflected upon Stephen and how Stephen was serving with honorable conduct.
And so think about all the dividends that has paid for it. So some man 2,000 years ago gets stoned, that another man watches that happen. It's not even just watches, he holds the coats. In other words, he's approving. That act of Stephen affects Paul. And think about all the good Paul has done in his writings that have had massive effects across the world.
Yeah.
So one man affecting another man, which has many dividends.
All of us have been influenced by teachers in our past. And eventually, like you say, those dividends will pay themselves forward exponentially as hopefully we continue to have influence on people in our future as well.
So when we think of Saul, we typically think of negatively, as you mentioned at the beginning. But this is something that we should be like Saul. We should pull that out of the scriptures and think about when he was called, he stepped up, he did what was right, he surrounded those and he influenced, and then he had mercy on those who treated him poorly.
Absolutely. Excellent thoughts. All right, Jamin. Well, thank you for studying the successes of Saul with me. Next session, we'll come back and we will be looking at some of his failures too.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook for more content like this.